So in this final video, I will be talking about how Russell applied or extended his theory of definite descriptions to also cover many other names. In order to understand how he did this, we're first going to talk about Russell's conception of propositions, which is importantly different than Frege's conception of meaning. So to recall, where Frege distinguished between sense and reference, one can say roughly that Russell did not just make that distinction, and in fact Russell thought there was only reference. So that from a distance, that is going to be the difference between Russell's notions of propositions and Frege's notion of meaning. But now let's get into the details of this. So let's begin with propositions. So what is a Russellian proposition? So according to Russell, the meaning of a sentence is a thought or a proposition. A Russellian proposition is a structure in which genuine referring expressions contribute the objects they refer to, and predicates contribute properties. So for example, suppose that the name Socrates is a genuine referring expression. So in 14a we have the sentence, Socrates is a philosopher. Now the meaning, according to Russell, is a proposition. And what this proposition is a structure that contains Socrates himself, as well as the property of philosopherness or philosopherhood. So formally, we can write this structure as a kind of a list or a group that contains two elements. And this is a proposition. So these two angled brackets represent that here we have a tuple or a list of two things. And the first thing here in this structured entity, which is this list of things, the first thing is Socrates himself. Okay, so this here isn't the name Socrates inside this proposition, but rather what I'm trying to represent here is that in this proposition, the individual Socrates himself, the referent of the name Socrates, is a part of the proposition. And the other part of the proposition is a property. This is a property of philosopherness or of being a philosopher. Okay, so essentially, the proposition expressed by a sentence, or the sentence Socrates is a philosopher, is a proposition which itself is a pair containing the referent of the name Socrates, which is Socrates himself, and the referent of the predicate philosopher, which is the property of philosopherness. Okay, so one thing to reflect on, and which we can discuss more in office hours, is whether Frege would agree with this characterization of the meaning of sentences. Okay, I think I've already kind of foreshadowed why he wouldn't, and also in the next lecture, I will discuss in more detail what the difference is between this conception of propositions or meanings of sentences, i.e. Russell's and Frege's. To move on, since Russell thought propositions expressed by sentences were tightly connected with the psychology of those using them, he furthermore held the following principles about propositions. The first of these principles is the principle of acquaintance. And what the principle of acquaintance says is that for any sentence S that a subject understands, she is acquainted with every constituent of the proposition S expresses. So as just explained, the propositions which are expressed by sentences are structured entities containing objects and properties. So what the principle of acquaintance says is that whenever a subject understands a sentence, she is acquainted with all the objects and properties that are a part of the proposition that the sentence she understands expresses. Okay? So that is to say, when you grasp or understand a sentence, and the sentence has a certain meaning, what it means for you to understand that sentence is to be acquainted with the parts of its meaning, with the objects and properties that make up the sentence's meaning. Now, the second principle, and which is related, is the principle of transparency. What this says is that for any two sentences, S and S prime, that a subject understands, she is able to tell a priori whether S and S prime express the same or different propositions. So, as we will see when we look at how the principle of acquaintance is employed in an argument for the theory of descriptions, and further in an argument for why most names are in fact secretly descriptions for Russell, we'll see that it will be revealed that Russell has a very specific notion of acquaintance. And if you choose one of the two essay topics or argument analysis topics about Russell, one thing you'll have to figure out is what exactly Russell means by acquaintance. But what is clear is that what Russell means by acquaintance is something that explains why he believes the principle of transparency holds. For the idea is that if for you to understand a sentence is to be acquainted with every constituent, if what it means to be acquainted is to be, in some sense, directly presented or directly aware of those things, then if you understand two sentences S and S prime, by the principle of acquaintance, you're acquainted with all of their constituents of the proposition expressed by both of those sentences, and then you should be able to tell a priori whether those are the same or different proposition. Okay. So now I'm going to discuss Russell's argument, or an epistemic argument, for the theory of descriptions, which is based on the principle of acquaintance. So the first premise is as follows. If you can understand an expression without acquaintance with an object, then that expression is not a referring expression. So this key premise follows from the principle of acquaintance and the claim that genuine referring expressions contribute their referent to propositions which the expression helps pick out when it's a part of a sentence. So let me repeat that. So according to Russell, a genuine referring expression contributed simply its referent to propositions that the name helps express. And then, given the principle of acquaintance, for you to understand one of those sentences, which the name is a part of, you have to be therefore acquainted with the referent. Now, one thing to reflect on is whether or not Frege would agree with the motivation for premise 1. However, moving on, premise 2 says that you can understand a definite description without acquaintance with the object that it picks out or that satisfies it. So here's an example. Consider the following sentence. The first baby born in the 22nd century will get COVID. The subject of this sentence, which is a definite description, the first baby born in the 22nd century, is one that we can understand. So we can understand what this sentence is saying. However, we are not acquainted with this thing that the definite description picks out because we are talking about something which doesn't exist yet. So it's plausible to say that we can understand this definite description and definite descriptions in general, without being acquainted with the objects that they pick out. And so, 1 and 2, premises 1 and 2, combine to give us a sub-conclusion 3 that definite descriptions are not referring expressions. Okay, so that is to say that, according to Russell, in order to understand a genuine referring expression, we have to be acquainted with their referent. However, we can understand definite descriptions without being acquainted with their referent, or the object they pick out. Therefore, definite descriptions are not genuine referring expressions. And so, according to his view, and this is again the step in premise 4, similar to the arguments above in the previous video, according to the theory of definite descriptions, these expressions only contribute properties to propositions that sentences containing them express. Hence, according to the theory of definite descriptions, in order to understand a definite description, you're not required to be acquainted with any object. So therefore, Russell's theory explains how it's true that you can understand a definite description without acquaintance with the object that satisfies it. Now, as an exercise, and something we can talk about in office hours, one can give a similar argument to the one just given against the claim that definite descriptions are not referring expressions on the basis of the principle of transparency. So that is something that would be worth trying to do. Now, finally, there's a number of reasons, including especially the epistemic reasons just given about what's required to understand expressions, according to Russell, which led him to the view that most names, most proper names, as we would call them, are in fact also disguised or secretly definite descriptions. So in this final subsection, I'll go over some of the motivations that led Russell to that view. So one question you might ask is, what does it mean to be acquainted with an object? So consider all the following proper names that we all understand: Plato, Charlemagne, Jupiter, two, humanity. These are all proper names that we understand. Hence, according to Russell, if they are genuine referring expressions, we must be acquainted with the object they pick out. However, it seems unclear that we are in fact acquainted with the objects they pick out. Another example is as follows. Suppose we stipulate that we will use the name Jimbo to talk about the first hominid to discover fire. So for example, I can declare that I will use that name Jimbo to talk about this first person to discover fire. And I can say things like, Jimbo was a genius. And these make sense, and you can understand what I'm saying. But now the question is, in what sense, if at all, are we acquainted with this person or this hominid or any of these other reference of these other names that I've listed? Now remember, and this is important again for one of the essay topics, that Russell held that acquaintance involved being directly presented with an object. However, many, if not all, of the names which we understand are plausibly for things that we're not directly presented with. Furthermore, recall the argument above from the law of excluded middle. According to the first premise, any genuine referring expression must have a referent. However, many proper names we use do not have a referent. For instance, an example above was Homer, for the alleged author of the poem, the epic poem, the Odyssey, and as well as the Iliad. So as discussed above, there is no Homer. There was no author. There was no unique author of these poems, since these poems were the result of an oral tradition. So the proper name, Homer, does not have a referent. So according to the argument from the law of excluded middle, the name Homer is not a genuine referring expression, according to Russell. Now, we also use the name Homer to talk about a fictional character from a cartoon. And another example of a name for a fictional character is Harry Potter. Now, there's no individual in our world who actually exists which either of these names pick out. These are names that are a part of a fiction. So these are other examples of names which do not have a referent. So again, there are many names which, according to Russell, cannot be genuine referring expressions. They must, according to him, or he concluded, that they must be in some sense disguised definite descriptions, that when we use these names, we actually have in our minds, in some sense, a definite description that these names stand for. So for instance, when we use the name Aristotle, we might have the description in our heads of the student of Plato, or the teacher of Alexander the Great. So what Russell ended up concluding, since many of his arguments for his analysis of definite descriptions also apply to most names, Russell ended up concluding that these names were also secretly, in some sense, definite descriptions. Now, in the next lecture on Kripke, we'll see a very influential critical discussion of that view. But finally, I'll mention another reason why Russell held that most proper names were, in fact, definite descriptions. And this final reason will motivate what he thought were the only genuinely referential expressions we had. So, finally, the principle of transparency entails that a subject is always able to tell a priori whether two referring expressions she understands are co-referential or not. So if you recall the example that of a Frege's puzzle from the previous lecture, so the ancient Greeks had two names, Hesperus and Phosphorus. The former, Hesperus, was for the star that they saw in the evening, and the latter, Phosphorus, was for the star that they saw in the morning. And they had these two names, and they did not realize that these two names were named of the same star, Venus, i.e. Venus rose in the morning and could be seen setting in the evening. Now, those are two names which we're not able to tell a priori whether they were co-referential or not, because the discovery that the Hesperus is phosphorus was an empirical discovery. So therefore, given the principle of transparency, Russell would have to conclude that these two names were not, in fact, genuine referring expressions. And in fact, Russell has to hold in general that the only things we can talk about with genuine referring expressions are things whose identity we can never be mistaken about. So also, to return to the idea of the law of excluded middle, these are things which have to be guaranteed to exist, and also for which we can never be mistaken about. Now, what Russell concluded, therefore, was that the only things that we can have genuine referring expressions for are private sense data. So, for instance, the notion of sense data are the private ideas or pictures that you experience allegedly when you see the world. So, for instance, imagine that you're looking at a table in front of you. some philosophers have thought that you don't directly see the table itself, rather you see a certain impression or say a brown coloring on your visual field, which is not the table. And furthermore, that kind of brown coloring is a sense data in that it could be there even if the table was not there, because this kind of brown shape on your eyes, so to speak, is a part of your own mind. And when you're hallucinating a table, say, that same color impression of a brown shape is still there, but the table is not. So sense data are things which always exist, regardless of whether you're hallucinating or not. And furthermore, it's plausible that you can always tell whether two sense data are the same, whereas you can see a table from different viewpoints, say, and doubt whether it's the same table or not. In a similar way that the ancient Greeks saw Venus in the morning and saw Venus in the evening, but were not sure or did not know that it was in fact the same star being seen. And similarly, for a physical object like a table, you can see it from different viewpoints, and it's always open for you to doubt whether it's in fact the same table you're seeing. However, with sense data, Russell thought, you could never doubt whether it's one and the same sense data because they're private mental entities that you're directly acquainted with. And for that reason, the only things that we could genuinely and directly hook onto with our referring expressions were these sense data. So for the various semantic and epistemological reasons just given, Russell was driven to conclude that the majority of ways in which we talk about the things around us are in fact via definite descriptions, which have a certain way of picking out objects, which is in virtue of describing them as being the unique satisfiers of certain descriptions, and not in virtue of us using genuine referring names to pick them out. In the next lecture, we will look at some very influential arguments from Kripke against this conclusion about applying the theory of definite descriptions to all proper names, as Russell did.